In the middle of the 1930s, the most feared man in the south of England kept a permanent address, and it was a suite in the Grand Hotel on Brighton's seafront, above the pier and the deck chairs and the striped bathing machines. Downstairs, the aristocracy took afternoon tea. On the hill above the town, on a racecourse the Prince Regent had once loved, his men walked the long line of bookmakers, taking a cut of every leather satchel, and the ones who refused went home with a thin red line drawn down one cheek. His name was Charles Sabini, and for the better part of 20 years, the sunniest holiday town in Britain was quietly run by the mob. This is the story of a place that was invented to be innocent, and of how that innocence became the finest cover a criminal ever had. To understand it, you have to understand what Brighton was for, because Brighton was a made thing. Somebody designed it and marketed it and sold it, the way you might sell a tonic or a spa. And they sold it from the very beginning as a cure. Before all of it, there was a small, poor fishing village on the Sussex coast, a huddle of black flint cottages and boats hauled up on the shingle, and it had an old name, Brighthelmstone. Nothing about it suggested a future. Then, around the middle of the 1700s, a physician from the nearby town of Lewes named Richard Russell began to prescribe something unusual to his wealthier patients. He told them to come to the coast, to bathe in the cold sea, and remarkably to drink the seawater. And he wrote a whole dissertation arguing that the salt water of the channel could cure diseases of the glands. It sounds like quackery now. At the time it was a sensation. Dr. Russell built a large house near the beach for himself and for the sick who came to take his cure, and the fashionable and the hopeful and the hypochondriac followed the money and the promise, down from London to the edge of England, to be made well by the sea. That would have been enough to make a modest resort. What made Brighton extraordinary was a prince. In the 1780s, the young Prince of Wales, the future King George IV, discovered the town, and he did not come for his glands. He came for pleasure, and he brought pleasure with him, and he never really stopped. He built himself a palace by the sea, and because he was who he was, it was no ordinary palace. The royal pavilion rose out of the Sussex shingle, looking like a dream of India crossed with a dream of China, all onion domes and minarets, a fantasy in stone dropped onto an English beach. Where the prince went, society followed, the gambling followed, the dressmakers and the confectioners and the demi-monde followed, and a town that had been prescribed as a cure quietly became something else, a place you went to be a slightly worse version of yourself than you dared to be at home. Then came the thing that changed everything, which was the railway. When the line from London reached the coast in the 1840s, the journey that had taken the better part of a day collapsed into an hour or two, and Brighton stopped being the private playground of the rich. It became the lung of the whole capital. On a hot bank holiday, the trains disgorged tens of thousands of Londoners onto the front, clerks and shopgirls and factory hands, all of them there to breathe the crisp air and eat the sugar and forget, for one bright borrowed day, the grey city they had left behind. One newspaper of the day put it perfectly. What Pompeii was to the Romans, it said, Brighton is to Londoners. They began to call the place London by the Sea, and here is the quiet, important thing about a town built entirely on visitors. Nobody there is really at home. Everybody is passing through, faces changing by the trainload. Nobody quite accountable to anybody. All of it wrapped in the bright, innocent noise of a holiday. A town like that is the easiest place in the world to hide something. And on the hill above the deck chairs, something had been waiting to be hidden almost since the beginning. Go back to 1783. In that year, on the high chalk of Whitehawk Hill, 400 feet above the sea and a mile from the water, the first official race meeting was held at Brighton. The year after, the Prince of Wales rode up to watch, liked what he saw, and came back with his hard-drinking, hard-betting, aristocratic friends, and the racecourse was made. It was a strange, beautiful, brutal little course, a horseshoe cut into the down, not even a full circuit, with a savage climb to the winning post that broke tired horses in the last furlong. And from the beginning, it did what racecourses do. It gathered money into one place, in the open air, in enormous quantities, in cash. You have to remember how betting worked then. For ordinary people, in most places, gambling was against the law. There was one great exception. At the racecourse itself, at the track, on the day, you could bet, and the bookmakers stood in their long row with their satchels and their boards, taking money hand over fist from a crowd that could swell past 20,000 people. There were no cards, no accounts, no records worth the name. There was only cash, mountains of loose cash, moving through the open hands of men standing in a field. To a certain kind of criminal, a racecourse was less a sporting event than a bank with no walls, no vault, and no guards. And after the First World War, when the soldiers came home with money in their pockets and a hunger to spend it, and the crowds at the track swelled to record numbers, the men who preyed on that cash organised themselves into something the newspapers would soon be calling race gangs. The racket they built was, in its way, a small masterpiece of extortion. A bookmaker needed a pitch, a spot to stand and work, and the gang controlled the pitches. A bookmaker needed to see out of trouble, and the gang was the trouble. So the gang sold him things he already had and did not want. They sold him chalk for his board. They sold him a wet sponge to wipe the odds clean between races. They sold him the printed list of runners he could have got for nothing. And the price of these useless little services was a share of everything he made. On some courses as much as half of it, 10 shillings in the pound, handed over with a smile, because the alternative was made very clear. The gang's trademark, the thing that ran through the whole story like a signature, was the cutthroat razor, the ordinary open blade a barber used to shave a gentleman on the seafront. It was rarely meant to kill, only to mark. A man who did not pay was slashed across the face, and the wound healed into a lifelong advertisement, a warning worn on the cheek that everyone at every course in England would learn to read. Into this world, in the years after the war, rose 2 men on a collision course. One came from the north. His name was Billy Kimber, and he led the Birmingham Boys, a hard, clever, road-travelling gang out of the West Midlands who had made themselves the masters of the race courses of the Midlands and the North. The other came from a single crowded street in London. His name was Charles Sabini, though almost nobody called him that. They called him Darby. Darby Sabini was born in 1888 in Saffron Hill, in the district of Clerkenwell that everyone knew as London's Little Italy, the illegitimate son of an Italian immigrant father and an English mother. He left school young, tried his hand as a boxer, worked the doors of Hoxton as a bouncer, and made his reputation, so the story goes, in 1920, when he broke the jaw of a rival gang leader with a single punch in a Clerkenwell pub. From there, it was a short step to running a racecourse racket of his own, and Sabini turned out to be very good at it. His organisation, by some accounts, ran to 300 men. It was said to include imported Sicilian gunmen, though his own family came from central Italy, and that detail may owe more to legend than to fact. He was not flashy. He wore a flat cap and a collarless shirt and looked like any other racing man, but he had a gift the others lacked. He was a diplomat as much as a thug, and he built quiet, careful, expensive relationships with the people who mattered, with bookmakers and with lawyers, and crucially, with policemen and politicians who found it convenient to look the other way. When the Birmingham Boys pushed south, onto the rich courses around London and along the coast, onto Sabini's ground. The two empires went to war. The papers called it the Racecourse Wars, and it was real and it was bloody. Gangs 100 strong met with hammers and hatchets and iron bars and bottles and razors. The worst of it came in the summer of 1921 at Epsom on Derby Week, when Sabini's forces ambushed a convoy of their rivals in a running battle that ended with dozens of men in the cells. By the mid-1920s, the dust had settled, the North had been beaten back, and one man stood on top of the whole southern racing world, from Epsom to Ascot to Goodwood, and, most profitably of all, to Brighton. The newspapers gave him a title, King of the Racecourse Gangs, and then, at the height of it, Darby Sabini did something that no one expected. He moved to the seaside. The immediate reason was money. In 1926, he sued a newspaper for calling him a gang leader. The case collapsed, and he was ruined by the costs and declared bankrupt. But a beaten man does not usually respond by taking rooms in the most expensive resort in the country. And Sabini was not beaten. He simply relocated the throne. He came down to Brighton and its quieter neighbour Hove, took a new name for the paperwork, and by most accounts became a more or less permanent resident of the Grand Hotel on the seafront, the last word in Victorian luxury, with the whole shining sweep of the bay laid out beneath his windows. Think, for a moment, about what that means. The man who controlled the racing rackets of half of England did not hide in a slum or a back room. He hid in plain sight, in a palace of chandeliers and sea views, in a town so associated with sunshine and candy floss and family holidays that no one could quite believe anything truly dark could live there. The glamour was not a distraction from the crime. The glamour was the disguise. Everyone in Brighton lived a little outside their real lives, so a criminal empire could live outside its real life too, in a penthouse, taking tea. Down on the front, the day trippers rode the little electric railway along the shingle. Up on Whitehawk Hill, on race days, his men walked the line and took their cut, and the money flowed down off the hill and into the town, and Brighton wore its bright innocent face and asked no questions. For a while the mask held, and then, in one terrible summer, it slipped. In 1934, Brighton acquired a new nickname, and it was a savage little pun on the old one. For 2 centuries, the town had been the queen of watering places. Now the newspapers were calling it the queen of slaughtering places. In June, a foul smell led a railway porter to a plywood trunk in the left luggage office of Brighton Station, and inside it was the dismembered torso of a woman. Her legs turned up in another case at a London terminus. Her head and her arms were never found. The press, appalled and thrilled, named her the girl with the pretty feet, and no one ever discovered who she was or who had killed her. Then, while the police were still searching, they stumbled on a second body in a trunk in a lodging house, and this one had a name, Violet K, and a suspect, a small-time drifter she had lived with. He was tried and astonishingly acquitted, and confessed only decades later, an old man unburdening himself to a Sunday paper. Now honesty matters here, and the truth is more interesting than the legend. None of this was the work of Sabini's men. The trunk murders were squalid, private, unconnected crimes. One of them never solved at all. But the newspapers of 1934 did not draw fine distinctions between one kind of Brighton darkness and another. To the reader in Leeds or Glasgow, it all ran together into a single sinister idea, that behind the sugar and the sunshine, this sparkling little resort was rotten somewhere in its heart. And into that idea, right on cue, walked a young novelist named Greene. Before we follow him inside, one thing worth saying out loud. That Brighton the mob controlled was never the whole town, not the schools or the councils or the ordinary streets. What they controlled was the money, the great engine of it, the racecourse and the betting and the rackets that fed on them. But in a resort town, the money is the town. Control the engine and you sit above everything, taking your tea in the Grand. Now back to the fall, because empires like this one do not end quietly. They end at the point where the violence finally spills past the edge of the racecourse and out into the daylight where the public can see it. The first blow was a piece of paperwork. Through the late 1920s and into the 30s, the Jockey Club and the Bookmakers' Own Protection Association began, slowly, to do the one thing that could destroy the racket. They organised. They started licensing the betting pitches properly, allocating them fairly, so that a pitch could no longer simply be seized and sold by whoever carried the sharpest blade. By 1932, a national body existed to protect bookmakers from exactly the men who had been protecting them. Quietly, clause by clause, the great profit stream of the racecourse gangs was being turned off at the tap. And then came the last great battle, and it happened almost within sight of Brighton, on the racecourse at Lewes, a few miles inland, the same little town where Dr. Russell had once lived, and where the assizes had tried the trunk murderer. On the 8th of June 1936, around 30 armed men, a London mob out of Hoxton, led by a hard case named Jimmy Spinks, came to Lewes Racecourse looking for a particular bookmaker and his clerk. They walked the line of pitches, scanning faces, until they found the men they wanted, Alfred Solomon and his clerk Mark Frater. Then they charged. They came with hatchets and hammers and iron bars and a knuckle duster, and while one man held Frater's arms, another struck him with a hatchet, and he went down under a rain of boots. It was carnage in broad daylight, in front of the crowd, and it was the kind of thing the authorities could no longer pretend not to see. This time the response was overwhelming. Scotland Yard's flying squad, led by detectives who by now knew every race gang face in England on sight, swept the whole thing up. 16 men were convicted at Lewes Assizes and sentenced between them to more than 43 years of hard labour. And that, more or less, was the end. After Lewes, the racecourse wars simply vanished from the newspapers. The great confrontations on the tracks and in the streets passed into history, and the era of the razor gangs was over. For Darby Sabini himself, the ending was slower and sadder than a battle. His profits had already been strangled by the reforms. When the Second World War came, his whole world of Italian and Jewish alliances was poisoned by the politics of the age, and in 1940, with Italy entering the war, the king of the racecourse gangs was arrested at a Greyhound stadium near Brighton and interned as an enemy alien, despite his English mother and the fact that he could barely speak a word of Italian. He was released, then jailed again for handling stolen goods. His only son was killed serving in the Royal Air Force, and when Darby Sabini finally died in 1950, the man who had ruled the south of England from a suite at the Grand ended his days as a small, ordinary, ageing bookmaker in the town he had once quietly owned. His empire did not die with him. It passed to other hands, the White family, and then to a new generation of London names. But it was never again run from a penthouse by the sea. What remains of all of it today? The racecourse is still there, up on White Hawk Hill, the same beautiful horseshoe cut into the down 400 feet above a town that mostly no longer remembers. The Grand Hotel still stands on the front, white and enormous, and you can take afternoon tea in it exactly as the aristocracy did, in rooms where the most feared man in England once read his racing paper. The trains still bring the Londoners down in their thousands to eat the sugar and breathe the air, and the deepest trace of the whole story is something you can hold in your hand. It is a book. Because in 1938, 2 years after the battle at Lewes, Greene published a novel set in exactly this Brighton, a novel about a teenage gang leader called Peaky who runs razor men on the racecourse, and about the older, richer, untouchable crime boss above him, a character named Corleone who lives in the finest suite of the finest hotel. Greene said openly that Corleone had a real prototype, a man who by then had retired to live quietly and respectably in one of Brighton's crescents. He was describing Sabini. The novel was called Brighton Rock, and its title is the sharpest thing in it, because Brighton Rock is that stick of hard seaside candy sold on every pier, the kind with a word printed right through the middle of it. And the terrible quiet point Greene was making is this: you can snap that stick anywhere along its length, break it at any point you choose, and the same word runs through the centre, unchanged, all the way down. That is the truest thing anyone ever said about this town. Brighton sold itself as a cure, a place of pure air and healing water and harmless holiday pleasure, sugar all the way through. But if you had snapped it open, in the years when Darby Sabini took his tea at the Grand, you would have found something else running through the middle of it, something harder, something that went all the way down and never changed, no matter where you broke it. The town went on smiling at the sea, and the razor stayed hidden in the sugar. If this is the kind of story you enjoy, the rise and fall of a single place with something dark buried in the heart of it, then subscribe, because there are a great many more towns like Brighton, and every one of them has a word running through the middle. And if you liked this one, YouTube reckons you're going to like the video on your screen right now. Go on, have a look.